Hello, hello. Today's guest is Andrew Aviste. Andrew's a classically trained painter who studied under Odd Nerdrum in Norway. We studied alongside one another at Ralston College, a new university dedicated to saving the humanities from the chaos of the abyss. When we were traveling in Greece together, I found that he had the ability to see through paintings and perceive previous drafts just based on some of the brushwork. And when we would walk by ancient pillars, he would often be able to point out minute details that everyone would immediately look past. I've always sort of prided myself on my ability to look at art and understand it, but I seriously had to humble myself upon meeting Andrew. So with all of that said, allons-y, and I hope you enjoy.
I think I've come around a little on modern art. I think I've turned against it. Maybe unfortunately, I don't know anymore. But
in what way?
I was getting through some of Epictetus's work,
Right.
And he said something like in one of his discourses, something like, "That which makes a horse beautiful is not what makes a dog beautiful. It'll make a dog ugly." So some things are beautiful with respect to whatever particular form that they have, and that ideal that's set for, say, a horse.
Right.
So whatever, if you have a dog and you're trying to make it beautiful, then it's set to some objective standard that's measurable and quantifiable. I would like to say quantifiable in reality.
Right.
Whereas if you're in the modern world and if you're coming up with a cartoon, then that which makes a cartoon more beautiful would be the standard that it's held to is something like in your imagination. And then is that even a real standard? And I think that's how you can bleed into these notions of constructs, that we say a knight is real, and then we assign beauty relative to we all mutually agree on whatever a knight is, rather than saying that a knight is reflective of reality in some way, and that there's an ideal embedded within reality that we are striving to work towards and attain and become. So when it comes to making a portrait of someone, right, you're set to the standard of that particular person, that their particular likeness, rather than whatever it is you want to come up with in your own head.
I think, Scott, he started to come around
Really?
last year as well. I think he was already mostly on the side of more objective kind of painting.
Yeah.
But the more we talk and the more he reads and
Sure.
everything, he starts to, I think, move further and further away from the modern art as well.
Yeah. I talked to him a bit about Basquiat and some of the pop artists, and he had his interesting takes here and there. The more I research I do, the more I look at amazing Gothic architecture and some of the frescoes on the ceiling. It just seems like the modern artists aren't reflecting anything other than their imagination, and then it becomes almost psychopathic in that you're just continually reflecting inward rather than
really narcissistic. I mean,
at very least,
yeah. That is, they're pulling beauty out of nothing, really. Beauty is something that just exists in the ether. I mean, but
well, it has to be, as far as I can tell. Well, okay. This is something I've been trying to figure out. So if you think of Raphael's painting of Plato and Aristotle, Aristotle has his hand to the ground, so he's focused more on the particulars, and Plato is pointed up, so he's focused more on the forms. And I think Aristotle explicitly states that Plato is wrong for looking for things in the forms. Reality exists in the. I think he's actually taking a swing at Heraclitus here, but I think he's picking up with Plato that things exist in their particulars. So it becomes this disagreement of who is right, what is more real, and I think beauty is the mediation between those two, or maybe the forms are beautiful, and then the paintings that you make are bringing the particulars of everyday of the everyday, and thinking of like is that Zeuxis or Zeuxis, using different parts of the most beautiful women in Athens to make Helen, like taking the particulars,
right,
working towards the form of the most beautiful woman in the world of Helen.
Right.
So, and I think to try and bring some of the modernists back in, the modern artists back in, maybe there's like an element of creativity that has to be involved with that, so that you can explore and reach the new things. But I think, okay, I have been thinking about all kinds of stuff here.
Okay, good, excellent.
When it comes to creativity, I think it has to be a tool used for the most beautiful thing, right? It's not necessarily, you aren't aiming at creativity. I think that's more towards Dionysus at the bottom, that stands under Apollo. That it's more. It's like saying we value diversity, because if you're a left-leaning person, you'll say something like we want diversity, and that means diversity of skin color. If you're a right-leaning person, you'll say something like we want diversity, but diversity of ideas. What you want really is to solve a problem. In painting, that means you want to make the most beautiful thing. Maybe that means involving diversity of skin color. Maybe that means involving diversity of ideas as a means to get that which is most beautiful. A mean to get to the solution of the problem. But it's the solution that you should be aiming at. That which is most beautiful is what you should be aiming at. So if you're aiming at diversity, what you're doing is saying something like, or creativity, this thing is valuable insofar as it's different from other things. So in some sense, they're still valuing something at the very least, but it's not valued in relation to the good. It's valued in relation to difference from other things. And that's not the same. That's definitely not the same thing.
Well, I would almost say that beauty is another one of those. Like, sure, certainly you should be aiming towards beauty, but it comes out of a skill, a really, really masterful skill.
Sure.
Like, you can't make something beautiful if you don't know how to make it. Right. And so there's a number of things that I find modern artists aim at that are really just side effects of someone who's actually mastered what they're doing. So, for instance, creativity, originality. Now, beauty is, I'm out on this. This is something I'm just kind of thinking of at the moment. But, for instance, originality is a huge sort of standard for art now. Like, you have to be original.
Right.
You have to be creating something new to show the world how you're unique, this and that. But originality is, I would say originality is the mistakes that you make.
Okay.
At least the kind that modern artists look at, the kind of originality that they look at is sort of a shallow originality. So you could make something new, for instance, you could take Duchamp, who put a urinal out in an art museum and called it art.
Right.
Like, no one had done that before. I guess in a sense that's original, but it doesn't make it good. Right. But I think if you are so good at what you do that no one else can do it,
oh sure,
now you've reached true originality, where it's, but even then it's not really original, because at least from my in my craft, because I'm looking at the works of nature. Right. So it's never truly original.
Right. It's something like, and maybe there's a humbling aspect to that as well, that you're taking from nature, or if you want to get platonic, the ultimate platonic form, beauty itself, without restrictions and limitations, something like that. And that's what you're taking from. At the very least, if you're thinking in an Aristotelian manner, nature, taking from nature,
Right.
and then I think you can make the case that beautiful art is the mediation between those two. It's the link between the particulars. Like you have to hold it to a physical standard.
Yeah.
That which makes a horse beautiful does not make a dog beautiful, and vice versa. But then you're refining it and figuring out what the best positions, what best. Like if you're gonna pick a model, you probably want to pick one who's physically fit or beautiful. And if you're gonna make something beautiful with it, maybe you'll stretch the neck a little so that it's harder to draw and you're kind of showing off. If you're a sculptor, maybe you'll take a woman's hair and make sure she's doing all kinds of amazing ornamentation with it to push it and make it more difficult, make it more beautiful, and but it has to be held to the standard of nature. Maybe that's it. Maybe held to the standard of nature and reaching towards that ultimate platonic form. Does that seem reasonable?
Right. Oh, yeah. That's very similar to the way I think about it. Really, a creation in general, on at least the human side of things,
sure,
where we're taking sort of plain, like lower things like dirt, or like painting. Paint is just mud for all intents and purposes.
Sure.
And you turn it into something, like you raise it up out of this mud into something
sure,
like higher.
In just terms of like the physical properties.
And the physical properties, but this also works within sort of on the intellectual side of it as well, and sort of this higher forms that you're talking about, where you turn sort of the normal human into a human who's the most beautiful or the most fit,
sure,
or whatever you choose to do. And
do you think that reflects back on the person though? Because if we're looking at portraits of Caesar,
right.
Caesar, he was sculpted to be very old, and some of the sculptors would add extra wrinkles in his face so as to strive more towards that ideal of wisdom and age and everything that goes along with that. And the coins that are of Caesar, he looks like a skeleton, and he's so old. So, do you think that reflects? I mean, I guess it does historically reflect back on Caesar and how we think of him. But if I want to get past the historic and say, is it propaganda? Is that which is beautiful? I guess the coin or the sculpture. Am I tapping on what you were talking about, or am I just going off?
No, that's a good question.
Tangent?
There's a lot going on, especially with like social standards as well.
Right.
So, for instance, in those times, an elderly person would have been like very wise, sure. And so he might not even look like that when they made those engraving sculptures, whatever. They might have made him look even older, just to give him more dignity, right? So,
as opposed to though Alexander the Great, where portraits of him are young and youthful and vigorous and brave and all of that.
Right. So there's also the standards of society, like what is important to the society at that time.
Sure.
So art follows that. Like it follows it. Some people say that it comes before and sort of shows the way. And then there's also the idea of the zeitgeist, like art follows the times.
Sure. Well, what do you make of that? Because if there is a creative element to art, then it seems like whatever you're doing in exploring art would come first and then lead the way. But if we're having a conversation about art, and I think it's this conversation. I don't think you can actually have this conversation if you're a modern artist and you're talking about creativity and self-expression, because there's no standard by which to evaluate art. Right. If we can talk about art, then we can measure I leave it much, but talk about the form of this paint, what the form that this painting is striving to attain, and evaluate and criticize it and talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a modern artist, then because there's no standard, we can't talk about it. I forgot the original point, unfortunately, of where I was going with that.
That's all right. That's a huge point that you just made, like the actual having a standard.
Right.
And but it seems like that's spread out into more of our society than just art. Like standards seem to
degrade.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, and it's not just so there is a you can say that art follows the times. I don't really agree with that though. I think it's sort of somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
So you have the philosophers come first. They're the ones that are really sort of paving the way for is artistic changes and societal changes in the end. Now, art is sort of, it's the way that it gets out to the general public, I would say. It unlike architecture, which I think Dr. Santil talked about, it sort of comes last in the line, right? Because it's such a monumental thing.
Right.
But like a painting, I could make a painting in like a month or two and put that out into the world with whatever philosophy I want embedded into it. Right. And maybe it doesn't catch on, but the philosophies that catch on, there's always going to be some sort of art that's sort of propagated that. And modern art is really, in some sense, it's Kantian.
Why do you say it's Kantian?
Well, because it's sort of, okay, so for instance, Kant in his Critique of Judgment basically talked about beauty as its own thing. Like he separated beauty from anything in the world, of beauty in itself. And he talked about creating something beautiful. You have to be so disconnected from it and have no real interest in it.
The beauty that's separate from the world?
No, so if we're going to create something beautiful, you need to be thinking like a child.
Okay.
You can't have these preconceived ideas. You can't have some sort of attachment to it. So for instance, and this goes back to what we were just talking about, like society and like societal standards, right? So that would taint, in his eyes, everything made during that time. Oh, you think that old people are wise and that makes them beautiful? Right. But that's not actually beauty, that's just your preference. It's a subjective interpretation. And so for him, the only way to actually create something beautiful is to be completely disconnected from it, have no interconnection. Your subjective thoughts aren't impinging on the beauty.
Right.
They're not tainting it.
You're not getting in with the fads or anything like that.
Right, exactly. You're just making pure beauty. But the only way to actually do that is to, and I think he doesn't actually say this, but this is sort of the logical conclusion that comes out of this, is that the only way to actually make something that you have no connection to as an adult is to make something that doesn't actually exist in the world itself, right? You're making something that's nature in itself.
Right. The ultimate form in and of itself. It has to, which in and of itself lacks matter, lacks limitation.
Right.
Because if you limit it, then you're limiting it to your own perceptions. And that's probably a fair point, because you could probably argue Kandinsky's doing a lot of that when he's the first to make abstract art. When you think of abstract art, he's the first to do that. When he's trying to embody music in the painting, and it's lacking any definite forms, any facial features, anything like that.
Yeah.
So it's trying to disembody it. But that brings us back to bringing in Aristotle, bringing in ideas. And I think particularly with faces, because human beings are very, very good at knowing when, and I'm sure you're able to attest to this. If I see a painting or drawing where an eye is even slightly off from what it should be, human beings can recognize it absolutely automatically. But if a forearm's a little bit off, no one's really going to notice it. So that makes me try and work towards the conclusion of something like human beings are made in the divine image of God, in that we're the most beautiful thing, and it's the most difficult thing to paint. I think when I'm kind of bouncing around a bunch of different ideas.
Yeah, go for
it. If you disagree with some of this, throw me out the door. But taking this actually from Roger Scruton, maybe the degeneration in art doesn't start with man-made, but it goes back to maybe a push in French painting where it's a move away from portraiture towards smaller figures in nature. Because if you get a tree wrong, if you get the leaves on a branch wrong, it's not that hard to tell. You can kind of get away with a lot.
Oh, absolutely.
But absolutely. If you get a nose a little bit off, the shadows on a face a little off, it's very, very evident.
Yeah. This is something Leonardo talks about this, Leonardo da Vinci, where you can basically ask anyone in the street, what do you like? Take a look at this portrait. What do you think? And they'll tell you. They may tell you something that's completely useless, but there's a good chance that if there's something wrong with it, they'll let you know.
Sure.
Right. And it's better to ask those kind of people than like your friends who might say, "Oh, it looks great."
Yeah.
Or ask your enemies even. They'll tell you straight up.
Sure. Sure.
But I run into this all the time. Like you could see it behind us. These trees are really just kind of like.
Sure.
You could really suggest it, and people just glaze over it.
That's probably why many of the Impressionist paintings, very few, if any, have any real facial features going on. I mean, I think Monet painted his wife once in a somewhat Impressionist
Well,
style.
Manet had some great, like...
Sticking with Monet and the Impressionists,
Yeah.
they're definitely, there's a reason they're drawn to nature and not to faces. You know?
Right.
And it's not like there wasn't much skill in many of those painters. In Manet, of course, in particular. But
They also recognized an issue, sort of the stagnation that was happening
you think so?
in the French, like academic style, where it became this sort of, oh, these are the steps that you follow. It became a very prescribed path to how you should be painting.
Sure.
And so they were like, well, it just seems dead when you start to follow too much of a prescription. Like and I tell this to people that I teach,
mm-hmm.
like this is a general like rule that you can follow, but don't rely on that rule too much. Rely on your eyes, because it'll start to look dead, and you're not actually thinking about it when you do that. You're just making the same painting over and over and over again, basically.
Okay. But before I jump on that,
Yeah.
Are there any specific examples that you could give about towards the start of modern art, any particular painters who did start to seem dead? Because I think I could think of one, but just be curious if you could throw any off the top of your head.
So, people might hate me for this, but I've never really liked Bourgeois.
Say why. Tell me why.
Like there's this. It's kind of like this perfection that really. It's a little sickening to me.
Okay.
In a way where, and you could talk about like Leonardo too, and a lot of his paintings were like he was aiming towards perfection.
Sure.
But something about Bourgeois. So it's not a very technical thing. This is a very good subjective thing for myself.
Well, Bourgeois is probably my favorite artist, but he was also going to be the example that I was going to give when it comes to getting stale and dead. Because on the road trip that I made, I went out to LA and I got to see his Song of the Angels, and that's my favorite painting poster. That's absolutely magnificent. But most of his paintings are of shepherd girls, and to your point about stagnation in the French Academy, and no one was more revered in the French Academy than Bourgeois. A lot of his paintings are pretty much the same thing.
Right.
That's what sort of disappointed me when I really started to get into Bourgeois, was that you have Dante Virgil, you have the Song of the Angels, and a couple paintings, Mary and Holy the Child, and not much beyond that though. It's right. A lot of shepherd girls. So to your point about stagnation, there's absolutely something there.
And it's kind of, I won't say scares me, but disappoints me a little bit of the atelier schools that are popping up nowadays. And they're everywhere now.
What is an atelier school?
So an atelier is basically a studio school where, as opposed to a college or university, where you're going to get like a degree, it's a bit more traditional.
Sure.
Where you're going and you're just studying how to paint, and classical painting. And they're all over the U.S. and it's some in Canada. There's some in Florence and in Europe.
But you said you had an issue with them?
Yes, because they follow the French academic method to learning how to draw and paint. And for instance, the bar drawings, which is sort of a step-by-step leveling up, per se, of how to draw and then how to paint. But it's very technical. It's not easy.
Sure.
And it's slightly better than like photorealism, which we can talk about that later if you want.
Okay.
But again, there's something missing in it. It is sort of just pretty pictures, right? It's not. You're not really getting that melancholia, that sort of. You're missing part of reality.
Then what's the alternative then? How should the schools be taught?
Well, I think they should have a much stronger emphasis on storytelling.
Okay, that's exactly where my head was going.
But also, and again, this could just be my own personal preference, but I think having a more painterly approach to making a painting. So, for instance, instead of having this smooth gloss finish, you see some brush strokes. You see them playing with the paint, right? And it not only creates an effect where your eyes are starting to fill in the gaps, and it really brings it out if you can accomplish it. But it's also sort of an even deeper rendering of reality itself. So instead of having this smooth, like, oh, that's skin, this is fabric, this is a tree, this is a table, whatever. Now you have, oh, these little paint marks, these strokes that become these things. It's like you see the building blocks behind it. It's all these little marks that when you step back, blend together and become a solid thing.
So let me push back on that then, because that means you're definitely a fan of Rembrandt, and you can see that in all of your paintings. But what if you take someone like Dürer, or you take the Mona Lisa, where there's just this endless refinement. I mean, there's absolutely something to that ability too.
Right. Anyway, this is where I struggle a bit, because I've come up against this before, and I don't necessarily know that I have an answer for Leonardo da Vinci, because he had a grasp of forms and like pulling the beauty out of a human being that's just beyond almost anyone I've ever seen as a painter. Like the Virgin Child with Saint Anne is an absolutely gorgeous painting. And okay, so I'll say this: there's so much that goes into a painting, into composing a painting, that for me to say it's just brushwork would be wrong. And perhaps Leonardo not stumbled, because I think he's very deliberate about it. He's found the perfection in so much other things, or by painting like that, it's led him to discover perfection in so many other things that it works so well.
But it doesn't seem to me that that's an exceptional case. Like even some of the early Italian Renaissance writers, and going back to Dürer as well, there is this tasteful, endless refinement. The hairs on Dürer's famous self-portrait, they're so minute and so detailed. And okay, so maybe to argue against that though, maybe I could say something like, if your brain is forced to fill in some of the gaps as well, there's this engagement that you have with the painting that's in the anagogical. So you start out where you are and you're looking to make the andragogical ascent to the most beautiful thing, and you're using beauty as a means to elevate yourself towards that. They stand above you as something more beautiful than you, and you have to engage with them and use them to inform your senses and inform your mind to make your soul or make your memory more beautiful, something like that. So if you've done that, then you know how to, you inform your senses and you inform your mind, inform your memory of beautiful forms. Then you get, it's easier to see beauty in the world because it's what you know, it's what your senses have been informed with. Right. So if you then can look at a Rembrandt painting, then maybe you can make, to try and rescue some of the modern artists, you can maybe bring in Sargent as well, that you're using that then to take a painting and engage with it. And maybe that lends itself towards creativity. I'm kind of dancing around it. It's hard to know here.
I know. Any discussions about beauty, you end up going out to the edge of like,
right,
what's.
And I think some of it's because we just don't have that conversation at all nowadays. Like there's a couple groups of people that I'm looking to target first when it comes to starting this podcast, and one of them is going to be painters, artists.
Right.
And it isn't. That's one of the groups of people I'd like to hit that I would love to talk to, but I don't think there's an audience for it. It isn't obvious to me that people will listen to podcasts about painters, and it's kind of what we alluded to earlier. There isn't a vocabulary around it, and maybe that's because the modern artists seem to have killed standards and using the vocabulary to talk about art. But,
well, they've also really separated it from the public at large.
Why do you say that?
Well, it goes back to sort of needing to be disinterested in it, to sort of achieve the beauty. And so that comes into the painting, right? Like the painting is just disinterested. It's, in a sense, it's supposed to be boring, so that you're not getting drawn into it and you're not finding this sort of sentimentality in it. Or not overdone sentimentality, like maybe someone like Kincaid. But like, right, like, shouldn't be any emotion in it, because then you might be drawing people into that rather than showing them the true beauty. And it just makes it boring. And even if you did want to go look at it, how many times, I'm sure people have walked up in front of it and said, what does this mean? And then you have to have the plaque next to it that tells you what it means, right?
Right.
It's because it's so like up in the air and sort of intellectually distant from the public in general. Your average human being, how could they find anything in there?
The best example, when you said tells you what this means, the best example of that is when you say you have a sign in front of a rock or whatever, it says, please do not sit on the arch.
Right. You're like janitors cleaning up piles of trash in the gallery, and that was the art.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. There becomes that disconnect where now you can't talk about it, like, because you see that when people walk through modern art museums, they have no idea what they have no idea how to look, but they're trying to seem sophisticated, and they're trying to be in part of the club.
Right.
But, and I say this just to be clear.
Yeah.
I used to do that all the time, and now I've pretty much entirely come around. Maybe I still try to defend Picasso here and there and whatnot,
but it used to be where you saw a work of art and you knew what was going on. Like, it was all biblical and
sure, right,
like very common themes, and even if it wasn't necessarily a direct story that you know, you can relate to another human being in a painting, right, or in a sculpture.
Right. The image of the Pietà, regardless of whether you know the story of the crucifixion, there's given that it's done well, will always evict some emotions from you. And because I think, you can tell me what you think about this, is when it comes to storytelling, is that if you're gonna make a sad painting, then under what conditions is someone going to be sad? Okay, well, I spilled my drink. Someone's going to be sad, but you're not going to be able to create the sadness of Mary's face after her innocent son has been taken down from the cross, once you're making a painting of someone spilling a drink. Like, I think there's more potential within the story of Mary, to just leave it here for a second, of Mary than there is in most, if not all, other stories. I don't know if you can be sadder than the Pieta, to have your innocent child die before you. That pushes towards religious questions and how art serves religion, probably how art serves religion. And
well, before we get there, I just want to make an example here. Versus film.
Okay.
Like, if you've ever been to a modern art museum, there's going to be probably some film playing in like a dark room.
Right.
And like, maybe people sit down because they're tired walking around. They're like, oh, there's something that's moving. This is more interesting than everything else. But that's not mainstream. Like, mainstream movies, they follow like really closely like archetypes and sort of general storylines, like the hero's journey and these sorts of things.
Right. If you look at Andy Warhol's film, he made something like 500 movies, and he sort of started the underground film movement, and they're just rebelling against narrative structure in storytelling. And nobody watches those. Andy Warhol's first movie was 6 hours of a guy sleeping, and that was it. You know, and nobody remembers Andy Warhol for his. Insofar as we remember Andy Warhol, insofar as he's a good artist, nobody remembers him at the very least for his movies. Nobody at all. Nobody in cinema history really cares about underground films.
No,
and I've seen some of them. That's for good reason.
Yeah, but even now, then this like films are starting to become formulaic, in a bad way, because you can't have formulas that you could follow as like a general guideline. I like the hero's journey, for instance, like an unwilling person drawn into adventure, and they grow, they go through hardship, they grow some more, and then in the end they come out on top. Like, this is a trope that you see throughout tons of films. But now it's sort of, it's becoming stagnant. I think it is. How many remakes do they kind of push out there?
Sure.
It's like, oh, let's remake The Lion King. I loved that movie when I was a kid, and like, I don't think there was one time I watched that movie as a kid and didn't cry when Simba's father dies. But it was a great movie. Now it's like, oh, yeah, that really did it. Let's remake that. Sure. Let's remake this movie. Let's remake this movie. This was a good one. Let's sort of just touching on people's
nostalgia.
Nostalgia, yeah, exactly.
Buying up a bunch of celebrities and replaying those old songs with what I think is heartless CGI compared to the expressive cartoons of those Disney originals.
Yeah.
I mean, as much as I have come around to dislike modern art, I think it's not like they're doing nothing. I don't want to dismiss them out entirely. I mean, when it comes to cartoons in particular, like, you can tell a story with a talking meerkat and talking warthog and lions and all the things that are amazing about the Jungle Book and the Dancing Bears and whatever. There's so much more that you can do if you're not necessarily beholden to the most beautiful standard possible when it comes to storytelling, at the very least. So I don't want to dismiss that out of hand. There's more potential within those mediums.
Well, I think this is actually. So I think one of the reasons for that, and you made a great point with the CGI, is that it's something that's fantastical, and they're trying to make it super real.
Right.
But not it's like, but it's so. They're trying to make it real, and of course it's not, but in a photographic way. It's, how do I put this? Instead of making human decisions on what to leave out, because like you always, whenever we make anything, we have to leave something out. We can't recreate nature in its entirety. It's been done mechanically, and okay, mechanically is the wrong word.
Why?
I'm thinking of like for instance, photographs. The photographs work as photographs, but as soon as you start trying to turn like a cartoon into a photograph, it gets weird. It gets weird really fast. And even paintings, like, have you ever seen those CGI recreations of paintings to make them like real people?
Mm-hmm.
Or they do this with cartoon characters as well, make them look like real people.
I've seen stuff with like Pokemon and
yeah, it just looks terrifying.
Right.
Right? It's not, because the artist who's made these cartoons, the artist who makes these paintings, or whatever sort of art you're making, they've made decisions on what to leave out and how to do it so that it just feels right. It's not, it doesn't, there is a sort of imperfection that happens, but it's a planned imperfection.
Sure.
And so that, maybe this just goes back to what we were talking about earlier, how, like, for instance, Leonardo was aiming at perfection, or artists in general aim at a sort of perfection of beauty. If you understand that you can't attain perfection, then you deliberately leave emissions.
True.
Where was I going with this? For example, you see this, and I think you mentioned this earlier. The face is, if the face is off, someone's going to notice. But if the arm is off, you can kind of glance over it. And Rembrandt does that all the time. If you see, I guess Samson being like blinded, like the guy who's blinding him, his arm is like this weird stubby little thing, and it's right in the foreground of the painting.
Sure.
But as a whole, it looks right. It feels right. And another example would be, and this is more of a real world example, would be if you're building, for instance, I built fences for years and years and years. And sometimes something that was actually level, you put your level on it and you make sure the bubbles in between, it doesn't look right. Maybe the house you're getting up to wasn't perfectly level, and now everything's like this, right?
Sure.
So you just make it look right. You sort of move the boards.
Adapt and put things within their context.
Right. So it's not, you're looking for maybe an overall correctness rather than each individual part.
Sure.
And this, I mean, I could keep going on this because this is like, just delves into painting entirely. Like, just.
Well, if you want to keep going, by all means. But when I'm thinking, Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, all the ladies singing with weird faces. If you put them together, you can tell what notes that they're singing, and there's a harmonious element to it. And I think that's definitely true with paintings, that there is this harmonious element, that you have multiple. These all look like they're generally portraits, but if you have multiple people in frame, they all kind of have to. They should probably stand alone and be able to be beautiful in and of themselves and communicate something in and of themselves. But they have to also make sense within the context of the situation, the setting, and the other people involved as well. Otherwise, you're just depicting two different paintings. Principle. There has to be this harmonious element to it.
Yeah, and that goes down. Well, even in a portrait, that goes all the way down into portraits. Again, back to a face. Like, one of the worst mistakes you can make as a painter is just painting features onto a face, rather than painting a face itself.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So, for instance, most people do this when they start. It's like, oh, I know what an eye looks like, so I'm going to paint the best eye that I can right here. And then on the other side, like, well, I'm going to paint another eye, perfect eye right here. Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to paint a perfect nose right here and a perfect mouth. But they've just been focusing on all the little details rather than the whole thing as an entirety.
True.
I mean, and that's not how we see it all. Right? Like, when I look at you, I see your eyes in, like, that they're in focus. Right? But your mouth isn't in focus when I'm staring at your eyes, right? If I'm looking at your mouth, now your mouth's in focus and everything else starts to blur away
That's gestalt psychology, that you see the whole more than you do particulars.
Right.
You'll group things based on their color, if they're in lines, or if they're moving together, you see the movement together. You don't see individual particular bits.
Right, exactly. And so that's basically every level of a painting, from the face out to the entire composition, is making sure that things are working as a whole, and that's very hard to do. It's easy to learn how to draw like a perfect eye, but it's hard to have that whole come together.
So as in high school, as a gen ed, I had to take an art class, and we were taught to draw a grid and have a picture of ourselves and draw each square in the grid individually. And I think that does help to at least get you to look at the world in a different manner, rather than just as the gestalt. You need to be able to see those eyes individually and whatnot.
Right.
But it also means that you have a bunch of weird squares that aren't shaded right, and everything is a little off, a little crooked.
Right.
So without maybe it's something like that. But you dive in and learn about the particulars, and then come out and rebuild the gestalt, rebuild the form.
Right. I mean, you're starting to, as you're learning how to paint, you're picking up on a lot of things that you don't realize, and then one day it starts to click. This has happened a number of times for me, where it's like I struggle. Something's wrong. I know something's wrong. Don't know what it is, but I know something's wrong. And then you just practice, and then one day it's sort of, and all the practice you've been doing sort of meshes together. And one of those was like this actual structure of the face. That is just so difficult, because there's so many different planes to work with, and it's easy, especially for instance, I'm looking at you and it's very soft, even like, and so it makes it hard to depict sort of the planes of the face, and one side like this and the other side like this. I mean, it's like a box, right?
Sure.
And then getting everything lined up, but there's more to it than that.
Sure.
Like you look at me and you see an eye, but it's not just the eye. This isn't just an eye. I mean, the eye is inside an eye socket, and it goes behind, and the lids cover that part, and there's folds of skin and muscle and all of this that go over it. And so one of the best things for me when I was learning how to paint was understanding the forms that are underneath, sort of trying to blind myself to what I think I know. Like, oh, that's an eye, right? And look for the geometry, the big general shapes. And you'll see if, maybe not with these lights, but if you squint at someone, their eyes disappear, and it becomes these dark, I don't know if there's a good example of it. The one behind you, but I don't know if the cameras can pick that up.
I doubt it.
Where I just painted the eye sockets there. I mean, the eyes are hardly there.
True.
But it gives it that, it doesn't look wrong, because that's actually maybe a little exaggerated, but that's really how we're seeing people. We just don't realize it. Our eyes tend to focus in on these little things.
Right. And I think, and we do a lot of filling in on our own, because human beings are very, very evolutionarily speaking. We're trained to see faces and understand faces. We have the whites in our eyes, and we're paying attention to where you're paying attention,
Right.
and all those things associated with that. But that, I think it's also important to understand that a lot of the nerves in your brain are dedicated to your facial movements and your eye movements and all of that as well. So it's not just, I think you can make an argument if we leave this out, that it's somewhat of a social construct, in that we all kind of mutually agree that we're seeing faces and that it's beautiful, but it's also that nature has dedicated so much evolutionary time and pressure to make sure that we can do everything that we can with our faces, as opposed to not being able to move the skin on our forearm like we can our facial muscles.
Right.
So it's also, it's pointing to the beauty, and and our eyes are looking to understand the beauty in the form of human faces, something like that. I'm trying to gerrymander this something like into human beings are made in the image of God, that we're the most beautiful thing. If you screw up a face, then everyone knows it. And
right.
And nature has put a lot of time to make a face what it is. So there are all these things converging on human beings and their face, and getting it right, getting it even slightly wrong means it's a bad painting.
Well, I mean, that's so. I mean, there's also like a ton of evolutionary significance to the face, right? And us being very sensitive to faces.
Sure.
Just as a social animal. And no, I'm not trying to be a blasphemer or anything.
Okay.
But like a dog can learn human faces. We can learn the expressions of a dog because we're social animals. Now, when it comes to being created in the image of God, I mean, that's a very literal interpretation. It's like we actually we actually look like God in some fundamental way. But when I hear that phrase, my first thought is more on the side of we can create things. It's less of like the image and more of the form, in a sense, and in the way that we can take. So it goes back to we could take mud and turn it into something more than it was.
Sure.
Right, and you have some animals for instance, like a beaver or muskrat that can build like these little dens and some dams and such things.
The way it seems,
but it seems a little more. I mean, I think there's an obvious difference between humans and beavers.
right?
We really are out. We really have the ability to be outside of nature, or at least to move against the flow of nature.
Right. Exactly. So one reason why the definition I use for quantifying beauty is the improbability of its existence, is because I think it gets exactly at that. So when Aristotle defines human beings, he says it's usually translated as man is the rational animal, and the Greek is that's a bit of a gerrymandering translation. The Greek is logoneho. He says we have logos. So what does it mean to have the logos? It's something like animals, even beavers. Whenever they take an action, they're just going through their instinctive drives. They're going with whatever is predicted, whatever it is you can, probable, whatever it is predicted. They're going through their subroutines embedded within nature. But human beings, we don't have to if we don't want to. Or we can look at our instinctive drives and just not do that, do something else.
Right.
And we can make acts of selflessness. Right. The notion of selflessness in nature is the notion of a welfare state in nature that doesn't exist anywhere. So to be conscious is something like looking at your instinctive drives and doing something else. And I think that can lend itself towards creativity. Maybe, I mean, this is tough, but that you have this element within you that can take the mud and dirt and turn it into displace energy so as to make it into paints, and then even more to make it something into a beautiful painting. Like we're something like, I don't want to say beauty, maybe beauty creating machines, improbable machines to try and maybe machines isn't the right word if we're not going by a predictive algorithm. But
well,
we're taking acts of improbability and making things that are improbable. So maybe that's where we can bring in creativity back and say, when you're doing something improbable, you're making something beautiful, you're also displacing energy so as to create it, so as to make it physically.
It's interesting. I remember you talked about this when we were at the inn as well, before we graduated. don't know if I have something to sort of counter that with. I mean,
Sure. I mean,
it's something I really have to think about
I think-
deeply on. And
sure. I mean,
like,
the arguments I would make against it, say, would be, I assume that when I think I'm going against my instincts, I actually am just going along with my instincts. So maybe it's a matter of can we do the unpredictable thing? And if we can't, this is a Kantian argument. If the world is
well, okay. So for instance, what if? I mean, because it's not always beautiful. The most
Sure.
in like.
right,
I mean, so for instance, you take, for example, like a bomb, like some self-guided missile going across halfway around the planet. I don't. Maybe some aerospace engineers might find some beauty in that, but I don't know if that's really hitting on like what is most beautiful.
So
The beauty in general.
the example that I used in the lecture that I gave was Goya's black paintings. That there's a form to them. That's not chaos or rubble or formlessness. There is a form to it. So in and of itself, it is improbable, say, and it would take a conscious mind to produce it. But the way it seems to me is that, and I made this argument then as well, is that it's the precondition for that which is most beautiful. So if you're in paradise already, and I take you out of paradise, then you're in a fallen state, and then you're low. But if you can work your way to transcend that which took you out of paradise, and bring yourself back to your elevated state, if you can transcend that which took you out, well then you're transcendent. Then you're in a better place than before. So I think that's how you get someone like, well I'll make this a smaller argument and then lead into the bigger one. If you're thinking David and Goliath, if it's a story about two mediocre soldiers in a battlefield, one kills another, it's not that interesting. But if one is quite massive and ugly and mean and terrorizing the Jews and all of that, then it starts to get more interesting. And what if the mediocre soldier who does beat Goliath, maybe he's not mediocre, maybe he's a nobody, he's an outcast and lives in the wilderness as a shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
And then now you have small shepherd boy against titanic ugly Goliath, evil Goliath. So Goliath stands as the relationship between the two, even more so, but as a remarkable story, an improbable story of the small shepherd boy beating the warrior Goliath. So the way I've rationalized it, say, or the way I try to argue about that, is that it's the precondition for the most good. So take the story to the ones further. If you have
Right, the most good comes out of the worst bad.
Right. You have Christ, who is God and doesn't need anything in principle, and then he falls and goes under the crucifixion, and then he transcends that, and that becomes like a question of the incarnate God and whatnot too. There's something to that story where I think he has to be incarnate just for the story to work.
Well, okay, so this is very similar to how I've been thinking about creation in sort of general human terms, where creation by necessity has to be taking things that are lower than it, take things and transcend them. That is creation.
Sure.
Right? A very general definition. But there are things that are made which are destructive. And so you have to look at it as creative and not just, oh, I put a bolt in this nut together and now I've created something, right? It has to have some actual good, something that actually brings other people up with it, right? So for instance, like you can make like a pornographic film, and that's and that's, I think by our standards now, we've created a pornographic film. and maybe you've created something out of material, but in general, it is not a creative thing. It is actually a destructive thing. It's something that destroys men's lives, this and that.
Sure.
And so, for something to truly be creative, it needs to lift people up with it.
Right. And the point about pornography is a good one, because it seems like there isn't an you make the argument that it tears people down, and that's probably fair. But I don't even think you have to necessarily go that far to denigrate. Well, I don't say that. I don't think you even have to go that far, because what pornography does is it meets guys where they're at. There's no elevation. There's no mystique to it. There's no be more than you are so that you can attain me. It's have pleasure right now at no expense. So, and then yes, everything about the degradation of your soul, say with pornography too, because it probably isn't even meeting you where you are. It's actually probably you're actually probably right. Is that
I think it's
way down here, and you're probably naturally here, and it's dragging you down. That's probably more what it is.
And I think this is where like the Christian sort of thinking, and you go back into the Greeks, and it becomes really important to have something higher, right? Like something to transcend to.
Sure.
For instance, if humans have killed God, then what's higher than humans? Is there anything higher? Maybe just nature, and it's nature, but then we start getting back into God, and we can control nature, so we're actually higher now.
Sure.
And so it just creates a place where you can't move any higher than that. And to my point about the Greeks as well, sort of the anti-creation is destruction, and what would that be in Greek? It's diabolo, to throw apart. It's the devil. Like,
Sure.
Literally Diablo.
Yeah, no,
right? Like, it's these things that just, and this is all modern art is too, right? It seems like a lot of modernity has become this. It's like, let's tear it down, let's take it apart, let's break it.
So you could definitely say that that's the case for Duchamp. Why would you say that's the case for other modern artists, though?
Well, when I say, okay, so maybe rephrase my terminology here, because there's quite a few modern painters, or contemporary painters, or ones that have almost contemporary, just died, like Andrew Wyeth, who
Sure.
made amazing works.
Yeah,
I'm thinking more on the sort of like the abstraction and sort of just kind of like rebellion.
Right, it's a return to Dionysus over Apollo, in the forms of a beautiful figure, say, and a push towards, I don't want to say the forms, but the forms without the particulars, something like that. And then it becomes, is it destruction? Is it Kandinsky or Mondrian? Are they destruction, or Basquiat for that matter? Because it's at the very least not Da Vinci, say, but why do you say? Am I putting words in your mouth? Do you think it's destruction? It just seems like it's
I
ugly
think
or something along those lines.
I think it is destruction of painting, right?
Sure.
But
at least in the phenomenon, you could say so. But why the particulars of a Picasso? Why the particulars of a Warhol?
Like you go up and you see it and does something to you that hurts you. Is that is this what you mean?
I'm asking. I don't know. What makes it destructive? Because I could see modern art as a phenomenon, destructive of art as a phenomenon.
Oh, because it's a. Okay, because you have skilled people. So in the beginning, you had skilled people that made the choice to start doing something completely different, and sort of taking their skills and really, I think Picasso, it took me 5 years. This is not accurate. The actual quotes could be different, but so many years to learn how to paint like Raphael. But it's taken me a lifetime to learn how to paint like a child. So like to destroy everything that he's learned and to
sure.
try and get rid of it and to try and then it's not you don't realize what's happened until the next generation comes through. Right now, no one actually knows what they're doing. Now it's like, oh, these guys painted like this. I could do that. And within a couple generations, like the quality, the skill is lost. And that's destructive.
Sure.
And I think that sort of thing has a huge, deeper impact on our society too. I mean, I don't know exactly how it's come about, but maybe it's not the art itself, but the philosophy behind it that's led to this. But again, I've seen this all over where this like skill, really masterful skill in something is not common.
Yeah.
It's not a common thing. I mean, you go to work, you do your 9 to 5, you come home, watch TV, go to sleep, and wake up and do it again. Like, it's just death. It's death.
I mean, if you think that whoever that person is will also be developing wondrous skills and being able to think of brilliant ideas, that these things are actually really hard to do. It's really hard to become a master painter. Like
Absolutely. It's your entire life.
Right.
And some people still, even if they work their entire lives at it, might not reach it.
Right. And then that goes back to the importance and necessity of having strong mentors and strong painters who have come before you who can teach you those things and maintain the discipline. At least have the notebooks of Da Vinci so that you can look and understand and study the technique as well.
Right. Now I will say this isn't universal in every field. I think, for instance, in the tech industries, there's sort of that people are trying to create these amazing things, and you do have brilliant people that have gotten into this, and this is really what they want to do, and they work towards mastering it. And there's a competition there that I think is really important too, to pushing each other further and further and further.
Do you not think that exists in the art world right now?
Not in terms of creating art. I think it's because you can't have. There's no real stable. Like, oh, this is good. This is good. This is good. It's just like an art critic comes along and says this is good, or some investor comes along and is like, well, they paid this kind of money for this painting, so now this is good because it's worth this much.
Right.
If anything, there's a competition for getting attention from people with money and knowing the right people. But that's really every industry.
Sure.
Right? It's just, that's what it is. I mean, you gotta know the right people.
Right.
You gotta be somewhat sociable and not make it an ass of
I mean,
yourself.
all those Renaissance painters, they were businessmen. They had their connections. They knew what they were doing. Getting in with the papacy and the Medicis and all of that as well.
But there's also demand for like the highest quality.
Sure. You've told me, correct me if I'm wrong, that some of the painters that you've known have had to put aside painting because there isn't a market for high quality classical art.
Well, it's tough. So you do see it where painters who know how to paint classically and learn how to paint. I mean, I'll give them that. They learn how to paint, then turn towards more abstraction and a more modern style of painting, so they can sell.
Sure.
And but again, you go into someone's, like your average person's home, maybe you'll see some sort of abstraction, very bland abstraction on the wall that they picked up some kind of print at Walmart or Kohl's or something. But I think people that are actually buying, like spending money on paintings, your average person, they're picking up like landscapes and like nice sort of scenery, right, as a decoration for their house. Now, where the real money is at, though, is in these high, top tier art collectors.
Sure.
And I think a lot of times they don't even care about the art itself. It's really more of an investment for them, or some way to get some tax cuts and
launder money around.
well, I could do that too.
Oh, and you see this with a lot of when people walk through museums. And you have the modern section and then you have the classical section. People spend way more time in the classical section than they do in the modern section. Even if there are the hipster types who do like to spend some of their time pretending to understand, trying to understand, let's say trying to understand the modern artist. They people don't, and people go and walk to the classical section to understand that instead, because there is something to understand in it, rather than
Right. And also just a recognition of like skill.
Sure.
Like you see something that's really well made, and like you look at it, like, wow, there's actually a kind of beauty in that. Just something that's really well made. Like you go, for instance, like I'll use axes as an example. There's this sort of resurgence of like hand forged axes for outdoorsmen and like, woodworking and bushcrafting, and these axes are like, they don't look like the axes you're getting at some hardware store that I pounded out in a press somewhere and God knows where.
Yeah.
Like, these things were handmade and they're beautiful.
You go out to Texas and you look at some of the museums, magnificent saddles.
Yeah.
It's just, and you go to Europe and you can see magnificent knight armor and Napoleon's beautiful guards there. And people can tell that it actually takes a lot of work to make something beautiful. It takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of discipline and practice.
Yeah.
Lifetime of it.
I don't know how, see I have Instagram and YouTube, right? And I see, I think maybe mine are tainted with these sorts of things, or it's like well-made stuff.
Sure.
But I'd be interested to like just open an account and see if there's any of that out there, or if it's just, I hate, maybe I'll disappoint myself by doing that.
Sure.
I don't know. But I mean, I think people recognize quality.
I think people do. I think a lot of it's just people don't talk about it. People don't have the vocabulary. The notion of something good and beautiful has become foreign to everyone. So either they're scared to or they don't know how. And
right.
Part of what I'm trying to do with this podcast, with hopefully talking to artists, is give people that vocabulary and get people talking about it. One thing I noticed what I usually notice whenever I talk to people about art or something beautiful is I'll use the word beauty and then they'll use cool or sweet or nice or pretty, some bad synonym instead of using the word beautiful. Like we have this fear of using that word. Hopefully I can do something to change that.
Yeah, because even if people recognize the quality, they recognize something in it. I mean, anything looks good next to something terrible.
Sure.
And that is right. Like I could paint a really crappy portrait and put it next to. Actually, Scott and I saw this in Greece. We went to the National Gallery in Athens.
Mm-hmm.
And in the modern section upstairs, there was like a ton of just stuff. And then there was one painting on the wall of like some fabric, like folding over. And it looked so much better than everything else around it. But I'm almost certain if we had taken that and brought it downstairs to where like all the more classical paintings were, it wouldn't have stood out. It would have just been like this, whatever. That's just a thing.
Right.
So it's good. People still need to learn. I think they can pick up on it in context when things are right next to each other. But to show someone and have them understand without necessarily having that context is very important.
Right, and that goes back to the vocabulary that I like to build with people, but also getting painters in front of people's faces.
Yeah.
I assume people can only recognize 10 paintings. They'll get through Great Kanagawa, they'll get Girl with Pearl Earring, Mona Lisa.
Maybe the Last Supper.
Yeah, not much more than that.
Yeah.
So I like to be able to talk about artists and talk about art and talk about particular paintings, and hopefully I'll be able to show some on the screen as I'm going through some of these video podcasts and whatnot. Get people familiar with it and get people inform their senses with that which is most beautiful, so that they can see, so that they become more beautiful in their soul. I really mean that, and help that to inform their senses and give them the tools to see beauty everywhere else too.
I love it.
We can end there.
Yeah, I wish you luck.
It's good talking to you, Andrew.
Good to talk to you too.
Thank you ever so much for watching. If you enjoyed that conversation with Andrew Aviste, then you will enjoy this conversation right here with Nate Spanos. Or if you like, you can check out this conversation right there with Anthony Jones. It's up to you.